Hello.
Good morning, ma'am.
Yeah, can
Yes.
you hear me?
Yeah, I'm just
Yeah,
making it.
okay, fine. I think I
I'm
finally
just making it
been
a,
unmuted.
a speaker's view.
All right.
Yeah, ma'am. You can start. Friends, amongst us, we have Madhvi Diwan. Everybody knows the legacy the entire family carries, but Madhvi Diwan, despite that legacy, she has been able to create her own niche. Mr. Shyam Diwan, everyone knows the right to privacy, Mr. Anil Diwan. But Madhvi Diwan has been an inspirational story, not only for the woman, but for the men also. She has been able to create her space the way she has created a space within the legal fraternity. I'm just reminded that why it is called the woman, because she has also wooed the man that this profession is challenging, but at the same time, it is very good. She is the third additional standing counsel for Union of India, additional Solicitor General of India, and a designated senior in Supreme Court. She represents state of Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra. The states and the private councils, private parties are always willing that she should represent them. Without taking much time, if we start discussing her success journey, we can complete the entire session only on Madhvi Diwan itself. Over to ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Vikas, for those very flattering words. And much as we are in very, very difficult times, I guess some of the very few silver linings of this time is that I get to meet lawyers whom I had the opportunity and privilege of meeting before. So hello and thank you for being here. When I realized that today is a Sunday morning, and I wondered whether a subject as heavy as the insolvency and bankruptcy code is appropriate, and how many people will really want to show up on a Sunday morning. But then I realized that given that we are in of lockdown, every day at a certain level is a Sunday, and every weekday is not very different from a Sunday. So I guess today is as good a day as any other. The COVID-19, of course, as you know, has had an impact on the working of the IBC as well as it has had on so many other things. So as I was saying, COVID-19 itself has had an impact on the working of the insolvency and bankruptcy code in more ways than one. And we hope that we will be back to good times will return very soon, because what is important is that we have achieved a lot from the insolvency and bankruptcy code. It's important to recount this success story, and despite the many, many hurdles that have been faced, but it's important to recount this success story and also ensure that when things do get better, that we can pick up the strings from where we left. That's important, because what we had before this, as I will point out to you, was a pretty abysmal state of affairs. Now, am I audible now? It's all right, yeah? Okay. Now, the IBC code of 2016 is arguably the most path-breaking of economic legislations that we have had, perhaps in the history of independent India. Now, the IBC itself marks a huge paradigm shift in the borrowing and lending culture of India. And along with certain other economic reforms, the IBC attempted to bring an end to what I would describe as a certain brazenness in the borrowing and lending culture in India, the culture which permitted us to default on loans without any consequences at all. Now, undoubtedly, the IBC has administered a huge shock to promoters and borrowers, because no longer can they be sanguine in the belief that they can default and their power and position in the company will not. They cannot imagine any longer that it will remain intact. And it's not only borrowers that it has impacted. The IBC has also shaken lenders out of a certain complacency that they enjoyed, a comfort zone where they were indulging in what one could describe as lending and pretending. That is, you lend and then you look the other way. There may be NPAs, defaults galore, but you do not take any action as a bank. Now, that was highly problematic. Now, the IBC therefore sought to put an end to a certain banking culture where loans would be what is described as evergreen. That is to say, repeated restructuring and deferring loan payments, banks fending off acknowledging that there were NPAs in the first place. And this resulted in a situation which became very, very unmanageable. Now, from the standpoint of both borrowing and lending, this was a culture which was long taken for granted in India. And the idea at the time was that, look, if we want to compete in the global environment, we've got to pull up our socks. We desperately need radical reform. And IBC was one of those very radical measures. IBC. Dire situations need very dire solutions. In 2015, the NPA crisis in India had reached very staggering proportions. The RBI realized that banks were effectively, as I said, evergreening loans. They decided to conduct what is known as an AQR, or an assets quality review. And this led to the discovery of staggering NPAs, which the banks themselves had been reluctant to classify as NPAs. According to an ASSOCHAM CRISIL report in the year 2018, the gross NPAs in India were estimated at crores. This is 2018. And this was a matter of grave concern for the banking industry, for the banking sector, as well as for the economy as a whole. Now, it's a little important to understand how things came to such a pass. And for this, we need to go back a little bit in banking history. Years ago, there was a very major measure of banking reform. That was the bank nationalization of 1969. Bank nationalization of 1969, and this was really intended at breaking the banker-borrower nexus, because that was a time when it was really big industrial houses that controlled the banks in India, and effectively they were lending to themselves. As a result, what was getting neglected, because they were borrowing, keeping the large pie to themselves, and what was getting neglected in the process were the other more productive sectors, the rural sector, the agricultural sector. So when nationalization took place, effectively there was a larger spread of banks across the country, and the agricultural sector in particular did improve. But the downside over time was noticed, and which is that banks had become non-competitive. Now, they had become non-competitive. There were shoddy lending standards, complete lack of competence, because there was little accountability and there was very little incentive really to set standards. Now, public sector banks showed inability to evaluate projects for what they were really worth. They took the safe route out. They would lend where they saw that there were tangible assets, collateral securities available, so they would simply lend. But what happened in the process was that there were many enterprises with great dynamic prospects, but these were ignored. Okay. So basically what happened is that good projects lost out if they did not have collateral securities to offer. Now, a vast proportion of the loans that came to be classified as NPAs date back to the mid-2000s. Now, this was a time when the economy was extremely exuberant because this was post-liberalization. Banks were generous with their loans and corporations grew highly leveraged because loans had become more easy. Now, this meant business houses were depending perhaps disproportionately on bank loans. and much less on internal promoter equity. Now, after the global economic crisis in the year 2008, the ability to repay was impacted. This led to what was known as the twin balance sheet problem, where both the banks and the corporate sector came under immense financial stress. And what exacerbated the problem was, as I mentioned, there was evergreening of loans. Banks were just simply not willing to acknowledge that these were bad loans. They had to be classified as NPAs. Now, again, there were many family-controlled companies which were very sanguine in the belief that even if defaults occur in their payments to the banks, their position in the companies will not be impacted. They will not be turned out. And therefore, they continued to borrow and the banks continued to evergreen these loans. Now, we had the Bankruptcy Law Reforms Committee, which was set up, and it gave its report in the year 2015. What it says is very important, and I'll very briefly summarize this for you. It says that India is one of the youngest republics in the world. There's great potential here, young, dynamic entrepreneurs, but it takes so long when a debt default occurs, it takes so long to resolve things. And this leads to very grave consequences because people don't want to lend. And small credit in the market is just not available. There's a disproportionate reliance on bank loans. And this is, they said, is a very troublesome state for the economy to be in, particularly for a young, dynamic, emerging economy. Now, until the IBC came into force in India, bankruptcy and insolvency was dealt with a range of very dispersed and scattered laws. There were multiple fora, and there was a great deal of judicial uncertainty, jurisdiction, multiple levels of appeals. Basically, in sum and substance, it was quite a mess. You had a variety of laws. For example, you had the Recovery of Debts Due to Banks Act, 1993. That is in the DRT, as we all know. Then there was the Sarfezi Act of 2002. And corporate insolvency was generally also dealt with by the Companies Act of both 1956 and of 2013. And you had another important act, which was the Sikh Industrial Companies Act, that is the SICA of 1985. Now, each of these legislations, and there were others for individual insolvency, that is the Provincial Insolvency, Presidency Towns Insolvency Act, the Provincial Insolvency Act, that is dealt with individual insolvency. So there was this range of very, very scattered legislation and so many different fora, so many different appeals, nothing was moving. Now, the World Bank reported in 2014 that the average time taken for insolvency in India is about 4.3 years, whereas in Singapore, it is 0.8 years, and in the United Kingdom, it is 1 year. Now, it's interesting because after the working 4 years of the code, till we came to this very unfortunate juncture of a stage of COVID-19, it had come down from 4.3 years to 1.6 years, average time to resolve insolvency. So we did make some great strides. It's important to remember this. Now, coming back to where we were in terms of the scattered regime prior to the IBC. Now, there was the Sikh Industrial Companies Act, which I mentioned, which was a very miserable failure, I would say, because instead of reviving the company, what it effectively did was that it built a protective wall around the promoters, and it effectively entrenched them, ensconced them firmly in the management rather than showing them the door, because they were the ones who were responsible for the mismanagement and perhaps the malfeasance in the company. Now, for years on end, companies would just languish in the Board of Industrial Financial Reconstruction, that's the BIFR. And this time, instead of reviving the company and giving something back to the stakeholders, this period was being used for the purposes by the managements, by corrupt management sometimes, to siphon away what was left in the company, to milk away everything dry so that there was virtually nothing left for the shareholders and the creditors and other stakeholders. Then came SARFAESI in 2002. Now, SARFAESI, of course, gave more teeth. It gave the secured creditors the power to go and take possession of assets. But the difficulty was this: once you take possession of the assets of the company, the difficulty is, are we still on? All
Yes,
okay?
Sarpan,
because there's something else that's coming on my
no,
screen.
I've told the team. Yes.
Okay. So, SARFAESI, of course, had more teeth. But the difficulty is when you take possession of the asset, it becomes difficult for the company to continue as a going concern. So this also didn't really solve the problem. So therefore, the IBC, in contradistinction with these earlier regimes, what it seeks to do is it focuses on resolution. It's not so much a recovery mechanism for creditors. It's not in the sense of a suit. It's not like a winding up proceeding either. It's different. Recovery may take place, but that is incidental. The real focus is resolution. Put back the company at the earliest signs of stress, try and get it back, put it on its rails, get it going. And only if that cannot happen within a specified time frame will the company be liquidated. So liquidation is effectively, it's a measure of the last resort. The real focus is resolution, get it up and running. Now, it's based on a principle of collective action where all the stakeholders have a role to play. Everybody gets something. And in the process, it is hoped that it will improve credit availability in the market. Now, if I were to outline 4 or 5 broad features of the code, I would grade them in this order. I would say number 1, speed is of the absolute essence in this code. If there were one feature one were to identify and say that this is the backbone of the code, the successful working of the code depends on this feature, I would say that it is speed being of the essence. If the timelines are not met, the whole thing comes apart. And that is what happened with SICA, etc. There also they said, yes, time is very important, but nobody followed it. Now, the point is that the CIRP, the Corporate Insolvency Resolution Process, has to be completed within a period of 180 days. There is, in certain circumstances, you can apply for 90 days more. And later, there was an amendment brought in because it was found that people were just languishing, matters were languishing in the NCLT, NCLAT, Supreme Court, and all that time was lost. The legislature came up with this extension that inclusive of litigation, maximum 330 days and no more. Now that I will point out to you, it has been tweaked by the Supreme Court in a recent judgment in SR Steel case, where the courts recognize that, look, we have to have ordinarily, it will have to be 330 days and no more, but in exceptional cases, yes, this mandatory word may be unjust, and therefore in exceptional cases, if the resolution is imminent, we won't have this mandatory provision will not apply. But otherwise, ordinarily, it is 330 days and no more. Now, there is a reason why this is important, this to meet these timelines, because the principle of the code is, and this was seen after how the SICA, etc. operated, was that it's important to maximize value for all the stakeholders, because the principle being that the passage of time is in inverse proportion to the value of the assets. As time goes by, the assets deteriorate in value, and once they deteriorate more and more, there will be less and less left for the stakeholders. Therefore, if you cannot resolve in the stipulated period, if the company cannot, there's no successful resolution plan and it's not approved, then better to cut your losses and go in for liquidation immediately. Don't wait for 20 years and then wind up the company like under the SICA, because then the stakeholders will get absolutely nothing. So maximization of value is also a very, very important feature of an object of this code. The third point is information symmetry. We were functioning earlier under a regime of information opacity when it came to bank loans and defaults. Today, with the kind of information symmetry that this code mandates, for example, the setting up of what are known as information utilities. These information utilities will serve as a ready bank of information. It will be like an electronic record readily available. The bank cannot then turn around and say that, look, I didn't know that X or Y had defaulted on my loans. Because ultimately, this is public money. Banks are also accountable and they cannot be allowed to turn around and feign ignorance. They have to be on their toes. They have to act at the earliest signs of stress. So information symmetry. Then, of course, I've mentioned collective action. Everybody plays a role and all the stakeholders get something or the other. The fourth is important, and I will elaborate this as we go along, which is the creditor in control regime. It is ultimately particularly the financial creditors who form the COC or the committee of creditors who take decisions on behalf of the commercial creditor. The management goes out. And lastly, an important feature of this code is entrepreneurship, to encourage entrepreneurship, because you will invite new applicants to see whether they can offer a good solution to be able to run the company. Now, again, when I discuss the scheme of the code, it's a very lengthy code. There are 255 sections, but we will corporate insolvency resolution, which is which has come into force. So far, individual insolvency has not taken off under this code. Now, the corporate insolvency resolution process is really a mechanism by which a corporate debtor a default of, originally the provision was only 1 lakh of rupees. If you have defaulted on a loan of an obligation of 1 lakh of rupees, then a creditor, whether a financial creditor or an operational creditor, can invoke the process. Now, it was because of this recent difficulty with COVID, the threshold limit, which was only 1 lakh of rupees, has now been increased to 1 crore. Now, that is because of these special circumstances, but the threshold was left deliberately low to start with because Parliament wanted to empower the small creditor. Because one wants to encourage small investors to start lending, not just banks giving large chunks of loans. So therefore, if you do that, you have to give him some redress mechanism. If a small creditor too can go to the adjudicating authority with an application, then he or she will at least feel that I can lend because there is some redress available to me. So therefore, the threshold was kept deliberately low. Now, the CIRP process can be invoked by financial creditor, operational creditor, or the company itself. Now, there is a difference in the process which is delineated for financial creditors and operational creditors. And actually, the difference between these two broad category of creditors has also, it's not just in the process in which you invoke the code, but also in decision making. Because financial creditors, as opposed to operational creditors, they have been given the power to take commercial decisions. They form what is known as the COC, and they will eventually company. Now, this was, of course, subject matter of challenge in the Swiss Ribbons case as to why is it that we are treated so differently. And this is the challenge was that this was an unreasonable, arbitrary classification between the two. Now, it's necessary to understand this this distinction between the two and why they are treated differently. Now, operational creditors are usually persons who there's a contract for supply of goods or services or there may be employees, or there may be government departments to whom statutory dues have to be paid. Now, these are persons, it's very different because they are really not investors in the sense, in that, in like financial creditors, whether a financial creditor be a bank or a financial institution or an individual investor. It is presumed that they understand a little bit more about the market, about the financial workings and the potential of this company before they invest. And therefore, because they are likely to have a better commercial understanding, it is they who are given the right to make that decision and to constitute the COC and take decisions. So therefore, you see, operational creditors, they are really interested in supplying goods and services and getting back their money. They don't really, generally speaking, the amounts due to them are smaller as compared to, say, banks. They are not really, they don't have that kind of commercial vision which a bank or a financial institution or anyone in the business of lending would have. So they are treated differently. Now, in the case of financial creditor, a financial creditor it's a much smoother process to approach the adjudicating authority with an application. The financial creditor doesn't give a notice, whereas the operational creditor first gives a demand notice. The company gets an opportunity to dispute it. If there is, unless the dispute is completely, frivolous, if there is substance, rejected. So even in the case of operational creditors, as compared to, say, bank loans or a financial debt, there is, there may be a greater scope for dispute. Because, say, for example, somebody has supplied substandard goods. I say there's no default. You've supplied it, it's completely, or you've short supplied. There is no default on my part. Whereas in the case of a loan or a financial debt, there is likely to be less, because it's all documented. There's less scope for a dispute. So that is the reason that they very differently, and this has been dealt with in many judgments. There are Innovative Industries, Mobilox, then you have Swiss Ribbons, and more lately Essar Steel. Now, when an admission takes place, there are three things which happen. One is that there is an immediate moratorium. That is, there can be no further recovery or other proceedings against the corporate debtor. The idea is to give the company some breathing space to be able to get a fair chance of a resolution. Because if you suddenly have everyone swooping down, it will not work, and therefore some breathing space is given. Now, but of course, lately the Supreme Court has held that corporate guarantees will not be covered. Those can proceed. Now, further, what happens, second thing that happens is there's a public announcement which takes place, and there is other creditors are entitled to submit their claims at this stage. The third thing which happens is very, very important. There is an interim resolution professional who comes in, and he is meant to supplant the existing management of the company. Now, this is a very, very drastic blow, but it is actually this measure, this facet of the code, which has perhaps led to the most positive deterrent results insofar as the working of this code is concerned. That is the ousting the management at this very stage of admission. Now, you see, I've pointed out to you that under the Sikh Industrial Companies Act, for years, companies would be in the BIFR, the management would still be there. They would use that opportunity to clean the company out. Now they are removed at the very threshold. They're out. And this was again one of the major grouses, and it was challenged in the Swiss Ribbons case. But the idea was this: fundamental principles of corporate jurisprudence, and which is that a company must be seen as independent from its shareholders. Now, a company being independent, its fate, its destiny may be separate from that of its shareholders. In India particularly, given family-owned businesses, whether they are publicly traded or not on the stock exchange, we think that it is basically like it's treated like a personal family jagir. And this is what the IBC really punctures, that you have to treat the company separate. If you cannot keep it default free, you have no business to be in the saddle, you will be removed, and somebody else who is more competent will be allowed to come in to run the company. Now, this is, again, this provision was upheld in the Swiss Ribbons case. In fact, even earlier in Innoventive and those earlier cases, it has been recognized that even at the appeal stage from an order of admission, the company can no longer be represented by its erstwhile management. So the message is very clear: you shape up or you ship out. And it is actually, there are reasonable opportunities which are given to the management. If you settle, if you pay up at the very threshold, and there are many opportunities, there are many stages in which they can be entitled to pay up and settle and finish the matter, then they can retain control. So this has actually led to a very large number of cases being settled at various stages. For example, before admission of the application, you may pay up and settle. After the admission, but before the constitution of the COC, then thereafter before the expression of interest by the resolution applicants, and thereafter also. So there are many, many opportunities. In fact, there's a provision 12A which was brought in for this purpose, because otherwise there were some difficulties. Now, so therefore there's enough of an opportunity for promoters to settle and to finish the matter. So therefore this is not some draconian measure. Section 29A was also brought in later, because it was seen that some of these promoters who had been ousted, they wanted to come in through the back door. So therefore 29A, I won't go into great detail because we don't have that much time, but section 29A was one of the first major amendments to the code, object of which was to render ineligible to be resolution applicants persons who have contributed by their defaults to the state of things. So the idea being that if you are responsible for bringing things to such a pass, you cannot be allowed to remain in the saddle anymore. Now thereafter, what happens is that resolution applicants are brought in. In the meantime, the resolution professional who is entrusted with the management of the company, he has to ensure that the company continues as a going concern. The operations of the company should not be disrupted, but of course he cannot take very major decisions. In the meantime, resolution applicants are invited, and the committee of creditors, which comprises of the financial creditors usually, they will take a decision as to whether this is acceptable to us or not. Now, the committee of creditors has also got to be very sensible and commercially wise in this, because they know that if we do not accept a reasonable plan, we may not get another suitor, we may not get another applicant, and time will run out, and then there will be liquidation. So all these balance out the process and the rights of the parties. Now, a lot has been said, and operational creditors don't get enough, they don't get a say, etc. But there have been amendments brought in to ensure that certain minimal liquidation value, there are certain minimal benchmarks which they get. Dissenting financial creditors also get that. So by and large, it's balanced out between all stakeholders. Another facet of the code I will quickly dwell upon is the roles of these various, what I would describe as dramatis personae. There is an adjudicating authority, that's the NCLT. There is a resolution professional, who are professionals created by this code. There's a resolution applicant. There is the committee of creditors. Now, all of these parties have to, all of these, as I would call them, dramatis personae, there are well delineated roles for them under the code. And it's very, very important that each one plays their own role and does not transcend or take over the role of any other authority. Because if you cross the Lakshman Rekha, there are problems. For example, these issues have arisen in cases like Shashidhar, in cases like SR Steel, where for example, in Shashidhar, what the Supreme Court has held is that if the resolution plan is rejected by the committee of creditors, the adjudicating authority cannot reevaluate it or analyze it or supplant its own wisdom for that of the commercial committee of creditors. It's the decision is there. They may take it or leave it. The adjudicating authorities it has to basically see that the provisions of the Act are met, basically ticking the boxes, the basic parameters are met, there's an equitable distribution, equitable treatment, and that is the sum total of the role of the adjudicating authority. Now in SR Steel, which was delivered last year, one of the issues which was raised was that could the NCLAT have said that no, contrary to the wishes of the COC, we will divide 50-50 the share which is to be got by the financial creditors and the operational creditors. And the court eventually said that no, equitable treatment doesn't mean equal treatment. You may give somebody less, you may give somebody more, depending. For example, one particular operational creditor, because his supplies, whatever he is supplying to the company, may be more important than anything else. So you give him priority. So it is up to them how they want to. They have to understand the business of the company, what's best for the future of the company. The decision is left to them. Because as I said in the beginning, idea is get the company up and running. Whatever that takes, they must do in the interest of the company. So the court has set aside the judgment of the NCLAT in that case and effectively. So it's very, very important that all these players play their own role, don't interfere with what the other needs to do, what the duty of the other is. For example, even the resolution professional. He cannot take certain basic managerial, basic administration he has to carry out. But certain other more management decisions, which may need certain other inputs, would be left to the COC. He has to basically ensure that the company is running as a going concern during that short CIRP period. Now, I'll just take about 5 minutes more, and I think then we can open it up if you like. There are 4 pillars on which this legislation rests. First, as I pointed out, the insolvency professionals who play a key role in the efficient working of a company. Then there are information utilities that store they are ready banks of information. So that the idea is have these ready banks of information so that if a bank wants to go to the adjudicating authority, there's a ready record that this is the status of the loan. It cannot be really disputed then by the corporate debtor. So ready bank of information provided by the information utility. Adjudicating authority, as I mentioned, is the NCLT. Then there is the Insolvency Bankruptcy Board of India, the IBBI, which is a regulatory authority, which also disciplines these various new professionals which are created, whether it's the resolution professionals, whether it's valuers, whether it's the information utility. So they regulate and discipline these new professionals. Now, this is basically it's a robust architecture where the NCLT performs a limited adjudicatory function. The resolution professional performs a management function. The COC exercises commercial judgment, and the IBBI performs the regulatory function. So therefore, this is meant to be a self-operating, self-contained process with minimal interference from the courts. That's also IBC itself was a very, very bold economic experiment. And naturally, it was faced with a lot of opposition and a lot of criticism in the beginning. And it was put through many, many Agni Pariksha. There were many levels of challenge. It had its own share of teething problems because, let's face it, everybody, including government, was learning along the way. There was likely to be some degree of trial and error. But there was a resounding victory in the Swiss Ribbons case where the court has upheld the constitutional validity of the legislation. And, you know, many teething problems and challenges, whether problems which had already been noticed or anticipating future problems that may occur, there have been a very, very large number of amendments to the code. And because it was thought necessary to iron out the creases as you go along, you see how things are responding. But I think despite, I mean, there have been many jokes also about how many amendments there are to the IBC. And that is true, there are many, many amendments. But this is really a positive feature because government is responsive and sensitive to the challenges which come in. So, you know, for example, home buyers, they were included as financial creditors. Now there is a basic threshold requirement that you need to have 10% or 100 home buyers approaching the adjudicating authority. So therefore, it is a measure of economic, it's an experiment, there's trial and error. But if you see the overall results of this code, what this code has yielded for us is really quite amazing. Because particularly if we were to look at India's ranking in the ease of doing business, it has improved by so many notches over the last few years. It's gone to 63 in 29. And in resolving insolvency alone, it jumped 56 places in 1 year to 52 in 2019 from 108 in 2018. So that's a big jump. It's a big jump. And out of, say, about 21,000 cases, this is the figures from late last year, 10,000 was settled. 8,500 cases were settled prior to admission itself. Now, this shows the deterrent effect. If that fear is dangling over your head that I'm going to lose management, I'm going to be thrown out of the company, you come back and pay. Otherwise, there's an incentive for dishonesty. So therefore, I think there has been a great deal of success. And India is among the world's top 10 improvers in the ease of doing business, largely on account of the effect of the IBC. And as I told you before, the time taken for insolvency resolution had come down from 4.3 years to 1.6 years. So I think that is, you know, the real net effect of the IBC. And as Justice Nariman in the Swiss Ribbons judgment, he said at the end, penultimate paragraph, he signs off by saying, very pithily summarizing the IBC, he says, the debtor's paradise is lost. And I think there can be no better summation of the IBC. Indeed, the debtor's party is over. So thank you very much for your patience. I think broadly, I think, yes, thank you. Thank you.
No. The way it has been summed up, even though it had a broad horizon, but if one could learn the manner of writing a summary or a précis, it is another way to how you can sum up the entire pages. The judgments in all these matters, we have all seen that invariably runs into pages and pages. But you have summed up in such a manner, the persons who are learning this for the first time, because some people are their students also in the participants and young professionals also, they would learn a lot. And the fact that there was low bandwidth at your side, still the participants kept on pouring, shows the message has been spread loud and clear amongst the groups that you should join.
I'm not sure what they heard.
No, but at least I have been hosting, this is our 26th session in continuation. The fact that there is stability in the participation and participants kept on pouring in, it only showed that in different groups it was going on that you should hear it. Despite the fact that there was some difference of the low bandwidth. Ma'am, I will just pose the questions for you because as we had discussed it. Would it be possible for an allottee of a commercial shop to initiate CIARP against the builder before the NCLT for recovery of dues in case of default in allotment by the builder, without joining hands with some other allottee to make it a class action?
So you see, that is the difficulty. That's the new amendment which has come in recently, and it is the subject matter of a challenge that you need 10% or 100. That is the threshold. So let's see what happens in that judgment. So the idea was that, a single, say you have 2,000 allottees, that can one single allotee disrupt the working of the corporate debtor? So anyway, I think this is a sort of, let's see what happens in that challenge. But currently, no.
Okay. Karan, under Section 14 IBC 2016, while the criminal proceedings are not suspended, but can a fine still be imposed against the accused?
So those are individuals. If they are individuals, for example, a corporate guarantee would not be covered. The idea of the moratorium, I think we have to remember, the idea is only that that the company gets breathing space, that you don't have recovery proceedings or coercive proceedings against the company for that period. It does not affect individuals who are, in any case, their managerial role has been put in suspension.
And ma'am, what can be done if the winding up order by the High Court has been passed just a day before the NCLT order was initiated? NCLT proceedings were initiated.
Well, if it's before, I guess the winding up order would hold. If the winding up order has already been passed, then there's not much that you can do. But currently, you see, winding up is now not an option anymore. Winding up is not.
Hello.
There's a lot of technical issues which I'm sure but you had also mentioned that there were some other issues that you wanted to discuss.
Hello. Ma'am,
at a more general level.
Ma'am, we can start with that. What is your take on this, on the COVID-19, regarding when it has been enhanced to ₹1 crores? People are asking what will be the effect of that.
You see, we are in a very fluid situation. And this is a very, very unprecedented situation that has brought the whole world, as we all can see, down to its knees. So we will have to see. But this is really only to ensure that companies are not, destroyed in the meantime because of, the difficulties arising out of the COVID-19. But I hope that at some stage, when things are back to normal, it will go back to the original 1 lakh. Because that is important. We must not forget the original intent behind the legislature deliberately keeping it low. Because what they noticed was that there is very little credit in the market. There is this disproportionate reliance on large banks, on banks to lend. And to inspire confidence in the market, to get people to lend, ordinary individuals to lend, you had to give them something in their hand, because otherwise your recovery proceedings were taking forever and ever. So therefore, it was deliberately kept low at 1 lakh of rupees. And I hope that things come back to normal, and eventually that was the idea. But just now, of course, we cannot afford to get, otherwise a lot of companies will face liquidation sooner or later. Yeah.
Ma'am, one way is there are just questions coming in and in. Or some people have posted, since some joined later on, how will you sum up the entire what is the effect of the IBC, and how do you see forward after the COVID-19 situation?
I think the effect of the IBC was, as I mentioned, was really the debtors' party is over. You cannot conduct a company in a manner, you have to keep it default free. And at the earliest signs of stress, this process can be invoked. Managements cannot take things for granted anymore. There's a huge deterrent effect, Basically, you shape up or you ship out, and let somebody else come in. Let another entrepreneur get a chance. And you're seeing in the case of ArcelorMittal, that's exactly what has happened. currently the situation is very uncertain. We'll have to give it a lot of time to see how things work. But I think it is important that we discuss the IBC at this stage, because we should not forget. I mean, this period may take a long time for things to come back to normal, but we should not forget the gains that we have made from this, and we shouldn't go back to square one. I think that's very, very important.
Mr. IP Singh poses the question, which will prevail, whether the IBC Act or the Rent Act, according to you, if there is a conflict between the two?
Well, clearly IBC, there's section 238, which is, overriding effect. What you can do is, if there are a lot of these little questions, because you said you wanted to discuss some other larger issues, maybe, you can mail me your question.
I am saying they are posing questions. You can go ahead with the manner in which you will say. I will ask them to post the questions. I will post it to you on the WhatsApp.
Okay.
What is your take as to how the things will continue from now onwards?
Well, we have to, and only once, manufacturing units are gradually able to start, and I think we are gradually moving in that direction, that things will come back. But this is a really unprecedented situation, as you can all see. Never imagined the world would come to this. It will take time. I imagine it's going to take a long time. So therefore, the government has put in these basic precautions. For example, the threshold of 1 crore, Section 7 is currently under suspension. So there are these measures which have been taken. Let's see how it all goes. It's going to take a while.
Okay. Meanwhile, we will ask ma'am's journey as what experiences she felt being a lady, how she, though she is already an inspirational story for many ladies pan-India. Meanwhile, many questions are being posed. I will send them to ma'am also to subsequently help us out. Meanwhile, the questions can be answered by any of the participants to anybody's query on the chat box. Ma'am, what has been your journey and your experience while you practiced in the Maharashtra and then ultimately you shifted to Supreme Court? What transitional phase you felt? And how do you feel that there is a space for the ladies? Because many people feel that you have created history, becoming a senior advocate, third additional Solicitor General of India, coming into a legacy of Mr. Anil Dewan, Shyam Dewan. And then we will come across as to how one should make a mark within the institution when such issues like you have just explained and just wrap up in a 45 minutes, how one should, once there is a big file, how you should sum up, how you should prepare the notes, and how to put it across to the bench once you are having short of time. Hello? Ma'am, are you able to hear me? Hello? Hello? Ma'am? I will just check regarding the connectivity. Is it audible now? You can make a re-entry. Yeah. There are certain technical issues on the Ma'am Madhvi's Dewan side. She's trying to re-enter. Meanwhile, we had a lot of webinars. One of the members from our team, Mr. Sapan, has already posted how many webinars we have conducted. You can just go to the webinar links. You can see the videos. And to follow up us as to what are the next sessions, etc., you can follow us up on the Facebook page and Instagram page, Beyond Law CLC, or you can connect us with the WhatsApp group also. That is Beyond Law CLC. Ma'am is trying to re-enter. Let's see.
Right?
Yes, ma'am. I think it's fine.
Yeah. So, well, I started in a commercial chamber in the Bombay High Court with Mr.
Ma'am, your video.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I started practice with Mr. Janak Dwarkadas, who is a very accomplished commercial practitioner. Who he wasn't even a senior advocate then, but practice in the Bombay High Court is very different from pretty much anywhere else in the country, because it's counsel practice means I have never had clients of my own. I have always depended on other lawyers to give me work, like all other counsel in the Bombay High Court. Yes, you're right. I mean, for women, particularly in the counsel, in that arena, it has been very, very difficult, because the counsel is expected to get up and argue in court. And I think women have suffered a lot of disadvantage in that department. We can see that there are a lot of women who have come up in law firms across the country. They are at partner level. But yes, you're right that when it comes to counsels and senior advocates, it's much less. Even if there are senior advocates still, particularly in commercial disputes, in high-end commercial work, there are very, very few women. That's a fact. I had the good fortune of working, as I said, with Mr. Dwarkadas, and because of the original side Bombay High Court work, one tended to get a lot of high-end commercial work. So even if there wasn't a lot of volume in the beginning, there was still very, very good quality work. And you said something about summarizing, and I might tell you it's an interesting thing that I learned then from my senior. You see, the computers, when they became very readily available. Initially, I think the first draft I did, I took it to a typist on the corner of the road, and I got him to physically type it. But later, there I was very careful, because I had to show the fair draft to my senior, so I had to ensure that there were no mistakes. But later, when we got used to, just tippity tapping on our PCs, we got, a little complacent. We said, oh, let me dictate something, then I will keep changing, and I will keep, it'll keep evolving. But I remember that my senior told me, please don't do that. When you are dictating a draft, make sure you're ready, you're totally ready. And once you dictate it, make minimal changes. And that really helped, because he said that will help your train of thought. And later, when you argue, you will be able to structure and sequence your arguments properly. So I think that was an important lesson to learn. We had a lot of, lists, even simple things like list of dates or written submissions. That was a lot of rigorous training there in the Bombay High Court. My transition to Delhi, by the way, it was very difficult. I came, basically my husband moved, and we decided as a family that we would move, but we have never worked in that sense together, except very occasionally when we have been engaged to work together. But it had been an independent practice all throughout, with challenges. But I think my message, at least, I don't see very many women here. I don't know how many you have, but the message would really be just hang in there, don't give up. Because I think after some years, suddenly things start improving. It's not an easy journey, but it's worth it.
I just wanted to know, on behalf of the participants, we just wanted to know that they say once there is a big tree, the small tree doesn't grow under the shade of the big tree. So how did you carve out your own space and the next tree, which has been another tree which is giving shade to many people? From coming to the family of the legacy of Mr. Anil Dewan and Shyam Dewan and creating your own space, that now people say that it is the other way around sometimes. They say that Anil Dewan is Madhvi Dewan's husband. So how to create that space?
My father-in-law, he was my father-in-law. Well, we all had very, at our own different levels, which may be very small or big or whatever, but we had individual practices. Nobody interfered in anybody else's practice. And so I don't think there was any sort of, I didn't feel that I needed to be compared to anyone. So, I mean, for me, it was about building up my own practice, and we were very clear that, nobody's going to recommend me, or nobody's going to certainly not from the family. So I think that is a Lakshman Rekha which we maintained very early on. And I think that was a good thing. I think the mistake a lot of women tend to make is that, and I see this, I call it a mistake. they may not. That's my view. That if you associate yourself, particularly so much with someone in the family, I think it can work against you, carving out your own identity.
So what tip will you give that how can one carve out its own niche?
Well, for me, it was easy in the sense that because I took to counsel practice in the Bombay High Court. So the only person that you can be associated with the counsel is your senior. And even there, the Bombay system is a very interesting one because you're never employed by anyone. As a counsel, you're not even paid a stipend, which actually in the long run, I mean, it's a struggle in the beginning. And unless you have, family support, it becomes difficult to survive in the beginning. But if you do have, if you're really able to get by for 2 years with some kind of other financial support, then I think it's good because you're always an independent professional. You're not anybody's employee. And I think that is a good system because very early on in the day, even if you have very few briefs, you may have, say, just a drafting brief. You may be briefed only to draft a plaint. But there is, you're treated as an individual, a professional. The solicitor who briefs you will pay you for that particular brief. He will appreciate your input. You're not doing it as anybody's employee. Then, of course, you learn a lot from your senior. You sit in his conferences, you use his library, you pick up a lot of things along the way, but you're still an independent professional. So I think that system, definitely, I would say it worked I think I gained a lot from it. It was hard in the Supreme Court in the sense that this doesn't exist in the Supreme Court, but I guess I thought when I moved, that I would wait it out if I had to, but I would not, I didn't want to be employed by anybody. That was a decision which I took. And I think in the introduction, I think somewhere on the net, they seem to suggest that I appeared for the state of Madhya Pradesh. I've never appeared for the state of Madhya Pradesh. That was a mistake. I've appeared a fair bit for the state of Maharashtra and a little bit for the state of Gujarat as well. So those were the state briefs which came to me for the first time in my life after I moved to the Supreme Court. I'd never done state work before. But it was a lot of variety, different types of work. In Bombay, we don't have so much variety. We have a lot of very good commercial work, but we don't have this kind of, appellate work. So I learned a range of different things. I had never done criminal work before, service work, none of that. So, I mean, I feel the quality varied. Some was up, some was down. But I think the point is that there was a lot of, it makes you better rounded as a lawyer. You feel you can pick up any brief, and if given a little time, you can do justice to it. So I think the Supreme Court makes you a better rounded, if I may say that, as a counsel.
Ma'am, another take from that, because we have just changed the model of the platform once you came. Otherwise, we just go for the Q&A. But the fact on the chat box, your expression was that probably the girls are not participating. On the chat box, large number of advocates, those who are ladies, and some ladies are still not sharing the names. But still they are saying that your words have, in fact, make them more resolute to do better. Another factor which I would like to ask, since I'm finding that the girls are taking it in a good way, what is your take how to maintain the balance between, once you're a married lady, the family, the professional work, how do you maintain all the balls together?
On a very amusing note, I think it was, if I can quote Indra Nooyi, she was as you know, the CEO of PepsiCo. And in one chat, it seems that she answered a similar question. And she said, marry sensibly. So I think, yes, a partner has, for both, I think for both.
And you would have to slightly come towards the speaker, because otherwise the bandwidth is okay, but the speaker is not.
So I think that, just a partner, whether for a man or a woman, a spouse, can make a huge difference to your the way you approach your life, your career, your family. It can make a huge difference. So I think women should think a lot, or even men should think a lot before they decide to sort of they choose their partners. But that makes a huge difference. But yes, I think that it was hard, and this is the one thing actually they don't teach in law school, how to manage to juggle, because you know your life today as a professional, even men, a lot of the time they have to do a lot of juggling, and nobody teaches you even while you're growing up or in school or in college, how to juggle your various obligations and make some success of all of them. So I think the fact that I was in counsel practice at a certain level, it helped me because we had longish vacations, and the fact that I was not employed by anybody, I chose to be self-employed, helped me because I didn't have to reach anybody's office at a particular hour except, you know, scheduled conferences. And when I was not in court, you know, I didn't uselessly hang around having coffee. I suppose I came home. Well, I've done a little bit of that as well. That's what makes life interesting. But I had the liberty of coming home. So, you know, not being employed and not being answerable. And my senior was very kind to me. He said, you know, first day he said, listen, I'm not a schoolmaster. I don't care, you know, when you come in or when you don't, or, you know, whatever, just. So you know, he really put the onus on the young junior that, you know, if she or he wanted to make a difference, and if you wanted to make yourself indispensable, you would have to work that hard rather than somebody, you know, regimenting. So I think those were important skills. And then, you know, because we had long vacations, I could make it up. I did a lot of my academic writing work in the vacations. So, you know, I think counsel practice and being self-employed definitely helps. Definitely helps.
Taking cue from the fact that you said that you had watched Indra Nooyi. Same, I had also watched Indra Nooyi. I remember Indra Nooyi, who had been asked that how did you ensure that your child is studied well? She said that the art of delegation has to be done very well.
Yes.
She said that what I used to do is that I used to give the secretary the entire questions, and the secretary used to ask the questions from the child as to whether you have done the homework, and the person at his home used to see that the TV is regulated at the time. Indra Nooyi is again an inspiration. Women like you and Indra Nooyi, Indira Gandhi, they are all persons who just inspire us to do well.
We are all learning. I can, at least speaking for myself, I say I learn every day. Whether my profession, whether the rest of my life, I feel I'm learning every day. But I think, yeah, it's, you know, I mean, there are different things that work for different people. You know, I don't think you should, or any of the young women here should sort of think that, you know, I should do it this way, or because X or Y did it that way. I don't, you know, I don't think that the same shoe fits everybody. You have to sort of figure it out for yourself, what works for you. I mean, personally, I don't think to me, it was important that I just spent, you know, fun time with my children. I have 2 daughters, and they are now 21, nearly 22, and nearly 18. But I never did their homework with them, and I don't regret it. And frankly, I don't think they regret that. But I did a lot of fun things with them. I thought that if we start doing schoolwork together, it would make it difficult and we wouldn't enjoy ourselves together. So I just left them to do that, and I think they did pretty okay.
3 tips from your side. What 3 takes in your entire career, if you go back in the flashback, what 3 tips would you feel that you should give to the girls who are on the platform and those who watch our YouTube subsequently, that how they should maintain the balance? 3 best tips.
You know, I make one confession to you. It was never my aspiration to be a role model for women alone. I've always regarded myself as a, you know, when I'm out there, I'm genderless. There's no, but I guess it is important for women to have other women in positions. And I would say, you know, when things are looking hopeless to you, and there will be many times that it happened to me, I would say just hang in there, because, you know, this is a race for the long haul, you know, and if you hang in there, I think there will come a time where suddenly your gender will become an asset rather than a liability. Because I found for myself that, maybe out of 25 years, 20, my gender in some form or the other, it was a barrier. It was a barrier. But in the last few years, it's suddenly just not that way. So I would say just hang in there. That's the lesson. I didn't know that when I was sort of growing up at the bar, but I know that now. So I would share that. And I would say that cut your coat according to your cloth. You don't have to be like X or Y or Z. Find your own way. Find what your assets are, and work. And this I would say to young men as well. Figure out what you're good at and synergize your your strong points to overcome what's not in your favor. So I would say that cut your coat according to your cloth.
The points and the way you are summarizing, and the chat box showing that it's an inspiration. The way you say that the nights sometimes become very dark and it gets depressing. I am reminded of Sahil Ludhianvi's one couplet of the song saying, "Koi raat itni sangein nahi, jiski subah rangeen na hogi." And the way you say that you have to push in. If we read that the bamboo stories of the Chinese, they say that for 5 good years the bamboo tree doesn't shoot up, and after 5 years when it shoots up, it goes to the 30 feet. So you're saying that the lawyer should work for 6-7 years and then they can shoot up, and then they say the sky is the limit. I will just as we are just chatting across on a different way and the people are getting it, I will just read the names who have just posed that your words have become an inspirational. One is Alka Chatrat. One is Devesh Bhatia. Divi. I do not know if that is a short name because that's Uma Satwant. Then he's a boy, Lankrit Bhadwar, he says. Advocate Mamta, who have taken an inspiration. I think even if we are able to make one person, one lady, one boy inspired to maintain the balance, it is just like when we go to the circus. We see the joker playing with the balls. He ensures that all 4 balls are continuously moving. That is family, the social life, the studies, that balls, how it has to be maintained, it is by you. Ma'am, before we end up, I will just formally. It was a lazy Sunday, and we discussed when I asked you to come on the platform. It was rightly observed at your end that it is a Sunday, probably people will not come. But I suppose you are a crowd puller on a Sunday. We had quite a good number of participants. That's quite heartening for us. And Sundays, as we all know that in all hotels, we get a good sumptuous brunch. So during the lockdown, we could not have gone for a sumptuous lunch, but we have got good food of thought and everybody would actually enjoy it. Thank you, ma'am, for summing it up on behalf of Beyond Law CLC. Yeah, we would look forward to that you should come on this platform. Siddharth Batra is a good friend of ours. He's well connected with us. He's practiced initially at Chandigarh. Then he has moved to Delhi and now he's practicing. I will just ask Siddharth. He will formally propose a vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for enlightening us with the insolvency and the bankruptcy code. In fact, your in-depth knowledge, I think for the viewers, will help them as well. You are a true inspiration for all the women lawyers, is that what I feel. Your contribution when it comes to the triple talaq case is an open secret. Everybody in the country knows that the great job which you have done.
Siddharth, you would have to come closer. Siddharth, you will have to come closer to the mic.
Okay.
Get inspired for better things from the ma'am.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
I know. Am I audible now?
Perfect.
Am I audible now?
Yes. अब तो आपकी आवाज दूर तक गूंज रही है.
Okay. Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your presence here. In fact, you're a true inspiration for every women lawyer is what I feel. And everybody can look upon you and say that sky is the limit when it comes to women lawyers. And your contribution to the triple talaq case I think everybody in the country knows about it. And in fact, my personal experience when I moved to Supreme Court 5 years back is that I noticed you before, and post that once I was visiting Mr. Shyam Diwan's office there, and I got to know that you were married to him. So in fact, you made an independent mark of yourself, if you have to ask me. And I, on behalf of Beyond Law and all the lawyers here, thank you for your time and thank you for your presence.
Thank you very
everyone.
much. Thank you.
Only before parting, one thing. In the evening, we have a session between by Professor Dr. Shruti Bedi, who is a known professor in the field of academics. She teaches in UILS. Along with, we have Sebastian Lafranzi, public prosecutor in Canada. They will speak on comparing the powers to amend the fundamental rights in India and Canada. So do connect with us in the evening at 6 o'clock. Let's enjoy the lockdowns by having knowledge from people like Madhvi Diwan. Ma'am, thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you for attending.
We all are waiting that we should, if the lockdown is continued, that we should connect again on the platform once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Have a good Sunday. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, ma'am.